Blessed be God, ineffable mystery, unbidden presence, the stranger in our midst. When I conjure up visions of the church making good trouble with local authorities, I see in my mind's eye Daniel Berrigan, the Roman Catholic peace activist who was repeatedly arrested for his protest of the Vietnam War. I see Martin Luther King Jr. I see the Occupy movement, Standing Rock. I see controversy. So it was that a recent headline caught me by surprise. It read, "Episcopal Parish and Partner Church threatened with fines for operating outreach ministries in a Philadelphia suburb." I mean, exactly how controversial could a food pantry be, right? So the article went on to describe how the zoning board of Pottstown, Pennsylvania, took issue with the outreach ministries of Christ Episcopal Church and those of a neighboring ecumenical partnership, ostensibly because by offering free community meal and a food pantry, they could no longer be classified as church. Curious, eh? My reading of the local press shed very little light on the motivation for these fines. But then you have to ask, what is a church? So according to local regulation, it is a building wherein persons assemble regularly for religious worship and that is used only for such purposes and for those accessory activities as are customarily associated therewith. It is most certainly the purview of a zoning board to define a church by its building, rather than Christ's body, as we hear today in the letter to the Colossians, or that phrase, ecclesia, a people called out, called in witness as Christ's presence for the world. But even if we're going to accept for a moment the board's arcane regulatory definition of a church, I think there are some questions of interpretation and application that remain open. The political expedience of the board's decision shouldn't be lost on us. The most challenging thing for the status quo of structural inequality is well-formed, well-organized, prayed-up people taking action. It's really hard to make good trouble or bring forth a beloved community if we're all anchored to the pew. So, better keep the church in its place, or so the board's thinking suggests. But there is also this kernel of truth in the board's zoning regulation, that the prayerful presence of its members is what tethers community organizing or outreach to a church, because otherwise it's a social service agency. Different, still good, but qualitatively different in its makeup. And that's what brings us to Mary and Martha. Now, I want to start with the disclaimer that the history of interpretation of this passage is about as salutary as the zoning board's decision. Again, there is a degree of political expedience in keeping two sisters anchored to their home, highlighting a little sibling rivalry about who's not doing their share, and then commending the good sister who sits quietly at the foot of a master. I get it. But to do justice to Mary and Martha, we have to step back and see, how does this story function in Luke's gospel? So we'll recall that Jesus has set his face toward Jerusalem, towards his mission. He is laser-focused. Jesus has called and equipped 70-odd disciples, and he's taught his friends with parables. can cast our imagination back to last Sunday when we heard the parable of the Good Samaritan, an outcast who saved a man left to die by the side of a road. And the Samaritan not only bandaged the man, but put him on his own animal, took him to an inn, paid for his stay, and assured that he could stay there and recuperate until he was well enough to continue his journey. That portion of the text ends, and then it moves quite swiftly into this dinner at the home of Martha. Now, if we look carefully at that text, Luke specifies that Jesus is at Martha's home, not that of Martha and Mary. And it's also really important to remember that we're in Luke's gospel, where there's no textual evidence that Jesus has any prior relationship with Mary and Martha. That's in John's gospel. So Martha's overwhelmed, maybe we can relate, and Jesus doesn't deny the magnitude of her work. She is worried and distracted by many things, and there are many things. But Martha's also pretty worked up because she is asking a guest that she invited into her home to intervene in her relationship with her sister, who may or may not live in that home. Friends, Martha is triangulating. And by contrast, there's Mary. She's simply present to the guest in their midst. By commending Mary's approach, the gospel centers presence as an essential ingredient in hospitality, and hospitality to the guest and stranger as an essential sign of our faithfulness to God. Now, I suspect if I did a cursory survey of this room and of those of you who are praying online right now, it would make plain the magnitude of what we're all dealing with. Personally, as a congregation, in our city, in the larger society, it's not light. I'm with you. But we can be faithful in any circumstance. It is that the quantity of demand does not prescribe the quality of our response. The quantity of demand does not prescribe the quality of our response. So toward the end of today's gospel, Jesus says to Martha, Jesus responds, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted about so many things, and there is need of only one thing. So let that be our optic for discernment. There is need of only one thing. So when I am trying to figure out how to be faithful in our lives of many things, what can we do with presence? Not with perfection, not with the circumstances we had 3 years ago or those we hope that we'll have in a decade, but now, in the capacity that we have now, what can we do with presence? Then, when this cathedral congregation asks the very important question of how can we best be hospitable to one another, to the seekers, pilgrims, and sightseeing visitors who come here, can we hold fast to that one criterion, which is presence? And then when we plan for programs and outreach and advocacy and dream of what this well-formed body can do and be for a world in need, can we hear the gospel command? Can we account for its qualitative metrics? Can we scale for presence? I would wager that the reason I'm reading about a 3-figure zoning fine slapped on a small Episcopal church in suburban Philadelphia is precisely because that church, Christ Episcopal Church, Pottstown, got really clear on the one thing that they could do well with their resources, about being prayerfully present to the hospitality of their neighbor, the needs of their community, and ultimately the one who came to reconcile the world to itself and to God. There is need of only one thing. Let's get laser focused and let's make some good trouble together. Because as much as we are called in to be refreshed, to be nourished as Christ's body, here, yes, in this building, here around this table, we are also called out. We are sent forth for the welcome of the stranger and for the life of the world.